emotional question as opposed to
us through what I think has been a really fascinating and fantastic day of discussing the complex and myriad problems surrounding contemporary surveillance. Joining me for our special final session today is Julia Angwin. Julia Angwin is a veteran journalist in the privacy space. She spent a long distinguished career at the Wall Street Journal before moving recently to the investigative journalism site ProPublica. She is also the author, quite recently, of Dragnet Nation, which is an absolutely fantastic book that you should purchase several copies of right outside after our session. And also joining us, and I know our folks in the booth are working on getting a couple technical issues resolved. But we are going to be joined by an unannounced guest. Edward Snowden will be joining us for a little question and answer. So our staff are going to actually distribute some index cards. So you've got about 15 minutes now if you want to write down questions for Mr. Snowden. We will be checking Twitter, so if you want to use the Cato SpyCon hashtag, you can send questions my way, and we will take a look at that, and we will begin as soon as we have Mr. Snowden looming behind us like a mid-'80s Apple ad. Yeah, we've got him here.
Aha.
Good afternoon, Edward. So thanks very much. So I guess Julia, do you want to lead in?
Sure. Welcome, Edward. Can you hear us? And
He's talking.
We can't hear you yet. Hold on.
Sorry, 1 second. Minor technical difficulties.
We can also do this in sign language. Let's see.
How are we doing, guys? No. So let's I guess let's just set up some questions. I think he can at least hear us now, so that's good, and they should have the audio resolved momentarily. I guess the obvious question here is we've had more than a year and a half of stories based on Mr. Snowden's disclosures percolating out, and looks like we're going to try and reconnect. Let's see if we can reestablish our connection. There's so we can, and you can see the Google people, I'm sure, will be happy to see we're actually using Hangouts for this.
Here.
We're back, maybe.
How are we doing?
Wait, I know exactly.
All right. So while we arrange for him to be able to be heard as well as to hear us, so we wanted to set up. Obviously, we've had a year of disclosures that have ignited a pretty fierce debate. So I mean, the obvious question is, for someone who has paid an extraordinary price and essentially surrendered a fairly comfortable life, was it worth it? But do you feel satisfied with what you've seen, how this is unfolding? We've seen some major legislation proposed, nothing yet passed. We've seen a presidential directive. Are you satisfied with the reaction you've had?
First off, I just want to confirm, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yay, hello.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Apologize for the trouble there. I am broadly satisfied with what's happened in the last year. We have seen an extraordinary change in public opinion, in public awareness. We have seen an increased openness, and I would say innovative spirit in government, not by choice, but by necessity. I believe we had Bob Litt speaking earlier, which was great to have him with us. And he mentioned that, they've decided they're going to be a little more transparent in the future because they recognize that these policies of overclassification, of over-secrecy, are not helpful. And in fact, they're damaging. And I think we should really scrutinize, the value not just of the government's, shall we say, improvement, and not just the encouraging rulings that we're seeing around the world in court systems. A number of panelists have spoken about beneficial things we're seeing in the United States court system. The first federal court system, or the first open federal court to review the programs, found that they're likely unconstitutional, even called them Orwellian in scope. The European Court of Justice struck down the European version of Smith v. Maryland, said the data retention directive, is unallowable. It's a fundamental violation of rights. We've seen the United Nations issue reports that said mass surveillance is not permissible under any circumstances. It's necessarily, or it's a contradiction of sort of our fundamental values, and it's an inherent violation of rights. And we see a lot of things like that happening. But beyond that, we see the real change that's happening is actually occurring outside of courts, outside of Congress, outside of the executive agencies entirely. And this is happening through things like technology companies. Let me actually make sure that I can see these right. What we've seen are things on the technological side, sort of in the fabric of the internet, where immediately upon the public awareness of the problem, technologists, academics, engineers around the world all came together and they went, this is a serious concern. And how do we address this? How do we solve these problems? How do we make sure we don't have to deal with this in the future? And we see that individuals as well are taking actions, taking steps to try to retrieve their rights that had been sort of unnecessarily taken out of their hands, out of their domain. This is a poll done by a Canadian group, so they don't really have a dog in the fight, which is why I cite them. They got a representative sample of internet users around the world, and they found that 60% of them around the world had sort of heard of the revelations last year. And of those 60%, 39% of those had taken active steps to improve the security of their privacy and communications online. And it was interesting how the media interpreted this, because they said, well, this is a minority. People must not care that much. Nobody's really making changes. But when you actually do the math on what 39% of 60% of the world's global internet users is, that's 702 million people around the world who are now safer today than they were just a year and a half ago. And this is, I think, really where we begin to see the framework of how we can move forward in the absence of political reform, in the absence of legal reform. And this is good, because what we've seen politically around the world throughout the development of human civilization, human history, is that politics is about bargaining. And when you have people in great power positions, when you have super states, they will not cede any sort of authority that they've claimed back to the public, back to civil society, unless they are afraid of a more undercutting alternative. And this is really what is setting us up to really have a sort of renaissance of security and of liberty in the way we associate, the way we speak, the way we research online. And this is critical, because when we think about reforms, when we think about all of the challenges we have in the United States, these are big picture problems, but at the same time, these are only the things that are happening within the United States. And as bad as the policies of the National Security Agency and Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI have been in regard to respecting sort of the boundaries of our rights, they are good relative to many other governments around the world. And so we have to think about not just how to protect the rights of Americans, but protect the rights of individuals around the world who live under regimes who are much less liberal and much more authoritarian. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that there are international standards that are well agreed upon as to what behavior is proper and improper. We have court mechanisms that can enforce these, and ultimately, fundamentally, we can enforce these through technology. On the basis of all of this, I would say I'm tremendously satisfied on the improvement that we've made.
Julia?
Well, hello, Edward Snowden. It is great to meet you because you did a great job of marketing my book for me. I was already halfway through writing it when your revelations came out, and I benefited greatly from that, so thank you. And also, I wanted to say one other thing. I don't know if anyone has seen Citizen 4, but in case you were not convinced that Edward Snowden was brave, appearing in your bathrobe is really a brave move in a documentary film. So if you haven't seen it, there's a bathrobe scene. So at any rate,
Entirely unflattering.
you know, everyone make their own choice about we could have a bathrobe up or down vote, you know. So, you know, I'm a huge fan of encryption, and I try to use as much encryption as possible. And I think that you're right that there's a renaissance of encryption programs going on. But I am concerned about an arms race, right? So if I, a citizen, am trying to beat huge agencies that are trying to defeat my encryption, and I'm trying to keep one step ahead of them, I feel like this is something where I'm underfunded, right? And I'm concerned that I'm not going to win that. And I think we have some evidence, actually, that the arms race is escalating. And I want to point to one thing that really disturbs me, which is we've seen a lot more spy tactics that involve spoofing. So we saw the DEA spoofing a Facebook page. We saw the FBI spoofing an Associated Press article. We saw the NSA spoofing a LinkedIn page. We've seen commercial hacking companies such as FinFisher spoofing Adobe updates. And so I would like to hear what you have to say about, can we win this race in a world where we might not even be able to trust the content that we see in front of us, right? Are we going to enter a world we can't actually authenticate anything that we see online?
This is a real challenge. Computer security is a field that is rapidly expanding, I think much more so than almost any other academic discipline. Because it's a fertile field. Computers are fundamentally so insecure today, it is impossible to rely upon them, impossible to trust them fully. Many of the reasons that I was successful in what I did was because I had structured a threat model in such a way that I did not have to rely on any particular computer, any particular communication to remain private. Now, this is not a world that we want ordinary people to live in. And this is the reason that we're having these debates today. This is the reason that people are fighting in countries around the world to push back against this kind of invasiveness, these kind of intrusive policies, but also simply the state of play in terms of our security around the world. Now, there are a number of business interests that have been referenced by some of the other panelists, Chris Seguin at the ACLU, Matt Green, John Hopkins professor, and many others who have referenced the fact that there are commercial incentives today to actually find vulnerabilities, to find weaknesses in our systems. And rather than work to fix those, rather than work to secure our systems, they actually leave those open. They will sell them to the highest bidder and use those to enable these exact kind of masquerade attacks, spoofing attacks, phishing attacks that you're describing. More concerningly, we see agencies of government, for example, the National Security Agency, which has security in its name, actually using this same paradigm to weaken our own infrastructure. We've seen them go to standards bodies and spy on them and look for vulnerabilities in upcoming standards. And rather than fix those standards, rather than correct those flaws, they leave them in, they try to exploit them. And in other cases, they look at where they can introduce them to make them less secure overall, to insert vulnerabilities where they did not exist before, so they could exploit them and sort of gain access. And we can understand the incentives for why an intelligence agency might want to seek to do this. It would give them access in novel places, places that were previously denied. But at the same time, those same vulnerabilities can be used against the American government, the American people, allies and other cities and other citizens in other countries around the world, but also in our products and services. And I know Google has had a pretty big presence here, but it's not just about Google. It's about every American service around the world and product. And if we're creating phones that have inherent insecurities in them, if we're creating flaws in our standards and protocols that every interoperable system relies upon to communicate, we're weakening the basis of our modern economy, because America relies more on the internet for productivity, for trade, for economic gains and comparative advantage than any other nation on earth. And yes, while inserting flaws into standards may give us some sort of comparative advantage in spying on China, once they discover it, they'll be able to use the same thing against us. And even if it's not them, even if it's Latin America, even if it's Russia, even if it's France, and they begin doing the same thing, we quickly learn that being able to spy on other countries, particularly based on how we restrict the uses of the product of intelligence. For example, the American government is very fond of saying recently that we don't give economic secrets to private companies, although they do use it internally for government dealings. We find out that the benefit of having secrets on other countries is worth less than the benefit that they gain from knowing ours, because we put more into research and development efforts than other countries do comparatively. We put more into education and research than other countries do. We put more in military spending than other countries do. So if everyone is insecure at an equal level, we don't benefit because we have the best spy agency. We actually lose because we are more reliant on security than everybody else.
Edward, you alluded to, and I guess what Julia was alluding to also, the spoofing and this is in connection with a sort of suite of malware tools collectively referred to as quantum. One of the stories to flow from your disclosures that I found way most troubling was related to that, the idea that there's a system apparently called Turbine that is delivering these in an automated way. It's a kind of, I mean, you think of it very crudely as a kind of AI for hacking that lives on the internet backbone and pushes out malware to thousands and potentially hundreds of thousands of target computers or categories of target computers. And so the goal is eventually to be able to sort of automatically compromise millions of computers around the world. That was a story. I was surprised at sort of how little, I mean, I don't know if anyone here, when I say Turbine, is that, you know, I guess this is not a representative audience, but I don't know how many people had heard that before. It seems like of all this sort of stunning stuff, people have heard a fair amount about the 215 telephony program and maybe something about PRISM, but a lot of the other stuff, I guess I'm surprised that it hasn't gotten as much attention as some of those earlier disclosures. I'm wondering what of the stuff that you've originated have you thought deserved, you know, a few more stories? What in there that hasn't gotten that much attention bothers you most?
Right. So this could be a talk that, you know, goes on for days as opposed to you know, just the short time we have here. But really, what you're touching on is a fundamental problem that we discussed earlier in reference to Congress. You know, we've got a few representatives who are trying to protect and promote the interests of millions of Americans. But the classification authorities who provide the clearances, offices like the DNI, say that their staff can't be cleared. Now, this is problematic because, well, you know, people in the DNI, people at the CIA, people at the NSA may say, I wish I had this, I wish I had that, I want private secretary too. They don't represent millions of people. They represent a small agency. The same dynamic happens with the press. We have a few editors, a few reporters who are not grounded. They don't have a background in technology. You know, they don't have PhDs in computer science. They don't know what stories matter, what stories don't. And technical reporting in mainstream news at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, is an incredibly modern thing. You know, this hasn't happened before. So one of the reasons that we don't see the media really keen on stories that are of critical importance are because they don't realize they're of critical importance. And because of this, we're increasingly reliant upon the technical community to kind of do this for us and represent us. Now, this is increasingly dangerous over time, I believe, because what we see is an increasingly disempowered citizen class, and even in the press, even in politics, because they have no idea what's going on in the world that matters, and an increasing empowerment of people who have sort of elite technological literacy. And I think this is dangerous over time because you will see a concentration of power around small groups, small individuals, who can increasingly impact society in greater and greater ways. I personally am an example of this. I'm not the world's expert in technology, but because I was where I was, because I saw massive crimes against the Constitution happening on an unprecedented scale, and I had the technological skills, the capability to do something about it, I was able to change the conversation in a way, make some small contribution to the public that has really had an outsized impact. But we do not want our government to rely on this model because that relies on the actions of individuals, and this is inherently dangerous. But to get back to the basic question, stories that have been overlooked, one of the very significant ones is the fact that all of this information we're collecting in bulk. Bulk collection is the government's euphemism for mass surveillance. It is the unreasonable seizure that is forbidden by the Fourth Amendment. These programs, mass collection programs, the 215 programs and whatnot, collect all of our information. But the NSA and the DNI and so on and so forth, they assert that this is okay because they apply what's called minimization to it. They say that if we see you're a U.S. citizen, we'll remove your name and replace it with a pseudonym with a placeholder. We will take measures like this to say that an analyst can't target a U.S. person, even though we're collecting all of your information and we can read all of your information. We can't do it by looking at you. We have to look at who you're talking to do it, that kind of thing. But this is not done when we're sharing this with overseas allies in many cases. There was a story that was run, I believe, late last year, that showed that we were sharing unminimized information, raw signals intelligence, that included information on U.S. political figures, on judges, on officials across the spectrum, private industry, private businesses, private individuals. Their private records were being shared en masse with Israel. This did not get a lot of play in the mainstream press in the U.S. And the New York Times public editor later investigated this and went, why? This is a story of incredible public importance. And there wasn't really a convincing answer. One of the editors who had previously sat on the warrantless wiretapping stories at the LA Times, I believe, also sat on this story. It got spiked. We also saw a story last year reported in the Huffington Post that found that the National Security Agency's documents reflected that they were intercepting, collecting, and then planning to use information on individuals' pornography viewing habits to discredit them in their communities and in the public on the basis of the political views that they held. Now, these individuals were Islamists, and their politics were considered radical. So we can understand why this sort of interest would be there. They go, well, we're preventing radicalization. But it also said within the reports that these individuals were not suspected to be associated with violence. These were not actually terrorists. These were people who, on the basis of secret judgments made by a secret agency with no public oversight and with no authorizing legislation, had decided that a certain brand of political viewpoints would authorize the intrusive monitoring, collection, and eventual disbursement of your private records related to your sexual activities. And this is a fundamentally un-American thing. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we allow this in the first place? And okay, maybe it happened, maybe mistakes were made, but how do we hold people to account for this? And I think this follows on to a fundamental point. And I don't want to beat up on Bob Litt here. He came to the forum, so he's kind of what we've got. He's doing a hard job, and we all know he's trying to do his best. But he said something that was fundamentally concerning in regards to the false testimony of James Clapper. He said that the real problem here was not that the most senior official in the United States Intelligence Committee committed a crime in front of Congress, because it doesn't have to be perjury. It doesn't have to be a willful lie to mislead. giving a false statement to Congress in itself, providing false testimony, is also a crime under USC 1001, I believe, 18, USC 18, 1001. That false statement is itself a crime. Now, he was not concerned about the crime, and he was not concerned about the impact that this had on the public. He was concerned that the question had been asked at all. And it is this kind of paucity of concern for the public's role in the function of American government that is the real danger represented by these programs. And I hope that this is, he spoke quickly, and that's not a representation of his true intent. But the reality is we see this consistently, and it becomes increasingly concerning about representatives of our government. It's this incautious language that causes them to lose credibility, that causes us to lose faith in the institutions of government upon which Americans must rely. He said something such as, it is indisputable that the disclosures of last year caused damage, that terrorists had changed their communications and that we had lost reporting as a result of these leaks. But the evidence on the public record shows that this is in fact not the case. It's entirely contrary, that there is no evidence on the record that this has been caused as a result of the disclosures that were made last year. Now, I do believe him when he asserts that, some sources of intelligence have gone dark. Some caps that we had up are no longer producing. But this is ordinary to the process of signals intelligence collection. People change their routes and methods of communication all the time. As anyone knows, correlation does not imply causation. But we also know from the evidence on record that there is no reason to suspect causation in the first place, and that there is actually no evidence for a correlation at all. Al-Qaeda's encryption methods have changed at the same rate, in the same manner, in the last year that they had in the years prior. The only study that has ever shown anything contrary was actually done by a contractor that is funded by the Central Intelligence Agency's investment arm. And so we really need to be careful about these kind of things and the representations they make. It is entirely in dispute that damage has been caused at all by these revelations. But the benefits of the disclosure are not in dispute. In fact, the Director of National Intelligence himself argues that it is necessarily in public interest to know about these policies, about these processes, and the fact that they should not have been classified in the first place in the justifications that are being made to disclose these programs. So how can it be that we use sort of the language that it's indisputable that all of these harms have been caused and that we haven't reaped the benefits? The answer is politics. And they're understandable. This is an agency, a community that sort of feels itself under threat. But this is unnecessary. If they're more open, we wouldn't have these problems in the first place. What happened last year was preventable. It was avoidable, in the same way that the torture program itself was avoidable. I mean, one of the things that was not well understood in the torture program was that individuals throughout the Central Intelligence Agency and other factions within the government knew these programs were wrong on both a moral basis and on a legal basis, and they raised concerns about it. The second bullet point there shows that people were concerned about how long it could go on for. The third bullet point shows that individuals were actually brought to tears as a result of being confronted with the reality of these programs. Others transferred away, and others said, prepare for something that's never been seen previously. This is unprecedented. And what is the response to this? When these whistleblowers within the agency raised concerns, and as this shows, it went into official cable traffic, which is extraordinary at the CIA, because having worked at the CIA, the only things that go into official cable traffic are things that have been coordinated and agreed upon by a number of individuals. Typically, only the chief of station in a country has release authority. The analysts write the report, the officers write the report, then they send it to their superior, who sends it to his superior, who talks at a round table about it, who sends it to the chief of station, and it finally goes out. And they were questioning not just the legality of the programs, but the utility of them at all. The questions were rejected, they were buried, and the head of the counterterrorism program said that these things, these concerns need to stop being put in official cable traffic. They need to stop being put on the official record. They need to be buried because such language is not helpful. And I think these are the things we as a society need to think about. How do we correct how do we restructure the incentives to ensure that when individuals have these serious concerns, when we see clearly unlawful activities occurring, as is still the case today, regardless of the justifications that are being put forth by this, that, or the other, when you look at them on their face and they are clearly at least in dispute as to legality, how can we ensure they are protected and these decisions can be made not behind closed doors, but in public?
So actually, because you mentioned that, it occurs to me that before we move to the questions from the audience, I figured might give you an opportunity to direct a comment to maybe a couple members of our audience, since you talked about what you regarded as illegality and the importance of mechanisms to correct for that. And we have Sharon Redford Franklin here from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is one such mechanism. And while they took a fairly dim view of the 215 telephony metadata program, the 702 authority that you use for PRISM and upstream collection, these are the sort of general warrants that involve a single authorization and then tens of thousands of targets overseas, tasked at analyst discretion. And we're basically satisfied with how that was being used, said that it seemed not to be used in an abusive way. I wonder if you were comforted looking at the findings of the board, or if you think that perhaps that they neglected something. Is there something you'd sort of suggest that they take another look at?
It is a challenging question because I have personally used the 702 authority in targeting, and I believe the conclusions of the board specifically in regard to the value, the potential productivity of the program, are accurate. It is an extraordinarily invasive authority, and it does allow you to get incredible intelligence when it's used in a certain way. The real danger, because when we saw the response to the 702 report from People Club, it was universally derided by anybody who had any peripheral connection to the issue, any kind of knowledge on the civil liberties issue, is that they looked at it in a kind of glib way. They looked at it in the way that I used it, which was on a targeted basis, where you looked at individuals who are already suspected to have some access, some nexus to this, that, or the other, particularly like the PRISM type authorities, where you're requesting content from a private entity. They weren't looking at the mass applications of it. They weren't looking at, for example, the upstream authority in sort of the detail that they should have, because that's where the real danger is. There are very few people who contest that we should not be able to pursue investigations using for almost any authority against individuals where you could get a judge to sign a particularized warrant. Benjamin Wittes earlier, he basically argued that should we have legislators involved, should we have public rules about the way we apply our surveillance capabilities, because Vladimir Putin might know about it? I say yes, because there is no court in the world, well, at least no court outside of Russia, who would not go, this individual is an agent of the foreign government. I mean, he's the head of the government. Of course, they will say this guy has an access to some kind of foreign intelligence value. We'll sign the warrant for him. If we know about the authorities, if we know how they're used, there's no problem whether they're public or private, because he can't elide them. He can't sort of hide in the noise. We know who he is. We know what his capabilities are. There is some argument to be made that this is not the case with terrorists, but we have also seen that mass surveillance is not beneficial in the context of terrorism. Despite all of the mass surveillance that happened under Stellarwind and other programs in the wake of 2001, they did not, all of this 215 collection, all of this internet collection, all of this stuff that's happening with retrospective search, where we can go through your Gmail boxes, where we can go to Facebook and say, I want to see all your contacts, I want to see everything you wrote, I want to see all your pictures, I want to see every IP address you ever checked in at, every device ID you ever used, all of these things. They did not stop the Boston Marathon bombings. In fact, they may have contributed to causing them because they gave us a false sense of security. They made us think that these individuals were not associated with terrorism, despite the fact that we have intelligence from human sources, including actually from the Russians who saw this guy going into Chechnya and saw this guy associated with terrorists, known terrorists, and said, hey, you might want to take a look at this guy. we didn't do a good job. The same thing overseas. Mass surveillance did not stop the London bombings. It did not stop the Madrid bombings. Mass surveillance has no proven track record, and it should not be a part of our policy. It should not be pursued. It should not be funded, because it takes resources away from things, methods and mechanisms of investigation that we know work and that we know are effective. This is a very timely analog to the torture case. We know that rapport-building interrogations work. We know that becoming friends with these people and saying basically the interrogator is your advocate against your captors works. And all of the intelligence that we got from the program that was beneficial was gained before we applied torture techniques. And yet we did it anyway. We funded it to the tune of millions of dollars. All of these individuals and all of these officials have never been held to account for what are unambiguous war crimes.
Edward, I want to bounce over and let Julia, if she has either a last question of her own before we turn to audience questions, or whether she
I
wants
want to challenge you on two things, actually, just because I have to stand up for journalists. So some of us do have some technical skills, and I built a team at the Wall Street Journal that had 2 technologists working full-time. And so I agree that there's that's not always true in every newsroom, but I just felt like I need to raise a flag for journalists. And I guess that leads me to sort of another question, which is that I think that the decisions that are made about publishing these stories are in the hands of a few people, and you yourself might not agree always, right, with what choices are made. And I wonder if, going back, do you think to yourself, maybe I should have sat and sifted through more carefully before handing over? Or do you feel that maybe there just needs to be a wider array of technically capable journalists? I just wonder if you could design the optimal system, where would it land?
You know, I don't want to go back and second guess the reporting in hindsight. I mean, we can look at the record and see that harms have been mitigated. If harms do exist, they are minimal. There's been no evidence in the public record, despite incredible incentives to show lives lost, harms caused, that it occurred. But there's always a chance that things could have been done better. And I can't say, I made no mistakes. This was perfect. What I can say was I was very concerned about my own bias. I evaluated all of the stuff that was coming out because I believed that it was in the public interest to know about these things, that these were programs and capabilities that went too far, that had constitutional implications, that should not have been, the government shouldn't have assumed for itself these authorities behind closed doors without any kind of debate, because they were limiting the boundaries of their rights. However, I mean, you can tell from my manner of speaking, it is an issue I am passionate about. And I recognize that I could be drawing the lines in a radically different way than what would be considered the public interest. And it's for this reason that I worked with journalistic institutions. And I demanded that they coordinate with the government, that we give the government a chance to comment and say, this could cause unnecessary harm if it was published in this way. If you redact this sentence, that's mitigated. To address those concerns and to allow them to draw the lines differently. I think by creating that system of checks and balances, which was intentionally to mirror kind of the process protections that we have in our own governance, that was really the only thing I could have done, because there is no way, sitting back when I was, where I was sort of operating with only the benefit of one brain and no debate partners on this, how I could ensure that we could get the best possible outcome. And I'm not sure that we have the best possible outcome of all worlds, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that the public globally agrees that this has worked out relatively well.
Should we start with the audience questions? There's a bunch of them about sort of how they can protect themselves the best.
We're gonna, I mean, so
yeah.
We are having a wonderful crypto party after this event. I don't think Edward will be able to join us to do tech support, but there actually are a surprising number of questions in there
There's
about
a surprising
that.
number, but actually I was going to go somewhere else with that, which is I think that actually it would be really interesting. We had 2 representatives from Google here, and I think it'd be interesting to just hear if there were like the top 3 things you would tell Google, like that they should do to make all of us more secure? Because actually the fact that each one of us is going to be less effective at doing it than if they do something for everybody or Apple. And so I thought maybe you could address it in a broader way, which is like, what are the things that should be done to secure the internet?
I think for sure we've got Microsoft in the room as well. So
Yeah, sorry, I'm not.
Your wish list for Google and Microsoft.
So the first thing that I would say is Google actually needs to stand in solidarity with the competitor here, and they need to get on the same page with Apple and say we're going to encrypt our phones by default. Now, I believe the reason they have not done this so far, although they don't want to talk about it publicly, is because the benchmarks that have been done on their phones that have full disk encryption enabled show that there's a pretty significant performance impact because they've got some kind of driver problem or the crappy hardware on the given model of phone, whatever. But really, we need to take a standard here that goes, the government does not have a mandate to say what corporations can and cannot do to protect the quality of their products and services. And if Google is not willing to take a position of leadership in the way that Apple is doing here, and say that the one thing we can do is say that when we sell you a device, the device itself is going to be secure, even if we can't guarantee the things that happen off device. They really have no place in the selling of actual hardware. This has really got to be the standard moving forward. And I would also point out sort of the counter argument there that I forget how they represented themselves in their introduction, but sort of the unrepentant statists would say, oh, this prevents law enforcement. Hey, guys, I actually worked, against Chinese hackers. That's a complete fiction. What someone said previously was that it's not going to be about compelled disclosure. It's going to be about using exploitation, using actual remote exploitation, basically flaws in services, flaws in websites, flaws in devices, for judges to say, I suspect this is the direction we're going. There'll be a debate around this as well. For the government to say, in this particular case, we will authorize you to commit a criminal act, hacking into this device, for the purposes of a limited investigation, which is analogous to the way that they tell police, we will grant you a warrant to do a sneak and peek on this house, or to kick in the door and search it. I think that's the biggest thing. Beyond that, we need end-to-end encryption, which Google is well on its way to doing, but many others around the internet need to do this. They need to commit to guaranteeing that they will protect the certificates that protect sort of these sort of end-to-end communications. Eric Schmidt made a reference to sort of 28-bit encryption certificates. And this is for the HTTPS, the little lock icon you see in your browser. If the government or any criminal group or adversary can gain access to this certificate, suddenly that encryption is meaningless. They need to commit to saying, all right, we'll make best efforts to protect this within our network to make sure it's not hacked. But they also need to say, if we receive a secret order from any government, any jurisdiction, we will fight this publicly to the highest court of appeal to prevent that. I think those are really the obvious best step things they can do that are relatively low effort on their part.
So actually, let me ask, because you've talked a lot about technical solutions, and it seems like in the background of this is that while you may be optimistic on the whole for the future of privacy, you don't seem very sanguine about the prospects for productive political change. We have a question from Sarah Harvard on Twitter. Her question was sort of particularly about HR 4681. I don't know whether you've looked at the Intel authorization, but really she's talking about that legalizing aspects of some of the programs you revealed. Let me just, in case you haven't studied that specifically, let me broaden that a little bit and say, is there legislation that you looked at that you feel is helpful or moving the ball in the right way? Or we have certain folks like Marcy Wheeler who, while a lot of privacy activists were supporting legislation like the USA Freedom Act, believed that in fact it locked in some of the very programs that it was trying to reform. Obviously this is Rand Paul's stated reason for not voting for that bill. I wonder if you could give us a kind of quick take on the legislative developments, even if that's not where you place your hopes?
Let me respond quickly on the Intelligence Authorization Act. And that's that we've got this Section 309 thing, which apparently some could read to be providing sort of a legislative halo, sort of a congressional recognition of EO 12333. That is an authority that only exists on an old piece of paper signed by a couple presidents. That basically says you can do whatever you want overseas, don't sweat it. If it's not happening over there, it's fine, do whatever you want. The problem with that authority is it actually collects Americans' communications as well, because in a global internet, of course, our own communications go to, for example, the Google data centers mentioned earlier that are outside our borders, and then they bounce back and come to us. So the NSA has in the past used this authority to sort of do an end run around Congress and collect information about Americans, although they'll say it was not targeted, of course, that did not need to be reported because EO 12333 is not required. There's no congressional reporting requirements on how it's applied because it's not provided through legislature. But we do have, again, Mr. Litt from the DNI, who has said on the record, and I hope everybody makes a historical footnote of this, that there was no legislative intent in providing that kind of halo. So if we're to have any faith in our institutions, we have to assume that this will be accepted, and that his statements can be accepted and relied upon. If that's the case, then let's go with that. Maybe it does just restrict the activities, but not authorize them. Beyond that, as far as reform legislation, we've got a lot of reforms out there which are good ideas and they make small steps, but we don't have anything that really solves the problem. We're looking at kind of baby steps reform, and this is fine. We've got to start somewhere. We've got to build some momentum, but we really need to, if I can suggest something radical here for a minute, we need to think more broadly about the kind of society we live in, the kind of guarantees and process protections that we want to enjoy in regard to our rights, in regard to our access to courts, in regard to our ability to challenge evidence that's not just used against us in court, but gathered for use against us within agencies through some kind of means. We have to have some way to provide for redress of grievances, which today does not exist. And could we actually take a bigger step back and go, all right, we have intelligence agencies, but where were these intelligence agencies born? They were born in times of total war, in world wars, in contests between superpowers. They were intended to exist for a particularized means for what everyone would imagine is a limited period of time until they would eventually be demobilized. Now, anybody who has an understanding of government knows that this never happens once we institute an agency. We never shut it down unless there's some kind of scandal and it can be avoided. But particularly in the context of state security agencies, right, spy agencies, do we really need them? Are they a product of developing societies, developing governments, developing civilizations that can be replaced by our methods of law enforcement? When we talked about, for example, earlier, Ben Wittey's reference to Vladimir Putin, do we really need the NSA and a secret court to say, hey, we're going to wiretap Putin? Or is it easy enough to get any judge to sign that warrant? I don't think we need a special mechanism to provide for targeted wiretaps, for targeted efforts to gain intelligence related to a particularized investigation. And it's not a far leap to say that we could provide for legislation that affords that outside of secret organizations that inevitably push the line beyond what the public would agree with.
Well, that's thinking outside the box.
I'm not saying I get that entirely. I'm just kind of thinking out loud because I wasn't expecting the question. But, why not? We have probably the most law enforcement funding of any government around the world, just as we have the greatest military funding. We've got these tanks driving around Ferguson. We've got Stingrays flying above, New York City and these other places, collecting all of our movements. We've got license plate readers. We've got easy passes that are tracking individuals' communications en masse and providing for retrospective searching, where police departments can go, hey, where was this guy March of last year? That is an intelligence power. When our police are capable of things that other countries' spy agencies aren't capable of. We need to start asking questions about what utility is unique to our spy agencies that cannot be provided through transparent public legislation.
So let me, I guess, chase one idea. You talked about the inevitable misuse of his capabilities. I mean, so a couple of questions along the lines of, it doesn't seem as though we've gone. I mean, there's some disturbing revelations in there in some of the documents you've disclosed, but it doesn't look like we see the kind of real Hoover level. Trying to drive Martin Luther King to suicide, really targeting peaceful protesters, stuff that not just sort of is disturbing because of the scale of what they're collecting, but the way it's being used in a sort of obviously anti-democratic way. Is it that do you think that that in fact there are uses we should be worried about in addition to the collection, or is it more that you're sort of prospectively worried the architecture is so fearsome that even if it's not being misused now, the damage if it were to be misused would be so much greater?
Well, one of the arguments I would make is, first off, remember, I worked at NSA, I worked at CIA. Both of these are outward-facing organizations. COINTELPRO, the attempts to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide, these were by the FBI, the inward-facing agency. And as so many guests have mentioned today, we have very little insight to how they're operating, and we don't have any effective oversight, even at the level of the DNI, he admitted, into how to manage this. Beyond that, let me argue by anecdote for a minute here and provide some data points. Just 2 days ago, a report was released that the Central Intelligence Agency tortured at least one man to death. He died after being tortured, chained to a concrete floor without pants, apparently, and froze to death. Beyond that, 29 other more individuals were disappeared. Now, I worked at the CIA, and I can tell you nothing happens there without people making a record of it, without people making a note about it, without people picking up the phone and coordinating for this. 29 people do not disappear from a secret government torture program without any records. So we don't know what happened to them. Maybe they ran away and disappeared off into the forest and are living a happy life now. We can hope for that. But the reality is much more sinister. When we look at the probability is much more sinister. The other things, rectal feeding, rectal rehydration, we've had physicians come out and say these are not medical procedures that have any indication for use on anyone, anywhere. And yet we were using them for what they said increased, it had the ancillary benefits of increasing compliance. If you think these things are not related to trying to get someone to commit suicide, but not actually torturing them to death, I would have to question your moral compass to some extent there. Not you personally, but in a general way. Beyond that, when we talk about scale, when we talk about scope, when we talk about domestic abuses, let me provide another data point and actually credit journalists, the technological investigation of the Wall Street Journal here, who I have not worked with. But they reported a story very recently that found that we were using sort of these Stingray type devices that have been, they basically ingest any signals that emanate over certain radio frequencies. That means your cellular phones, that means the wireless cards on your laptops, that means certain kinds of smart cards and things like that, although smart cards probably can't be heard from up in the air. And they correlate these to the device identifiers. Then we simply do a little bit of reverse searching to correlate the device identifier with the username that you log in to, say, your iTunes account or your Google Play account, and suddenly we know who owns that phone. Now, we can then correlate this really briefly with going, all right, we've got a plane that's circuiting over this level, and it hears this phone at this point in the transit, this point in the transit, this point in the transit. You've got enough points you can triangulate location. You can then index that location. This is actually very compressible data because it's all metadata. There's no content here. It's very small amounts of data that allow them to create a comprehensive index of the movements of not just a targeted individual, but by necessity, in order to have the data set to get these analytics to work, they have the data set of everyone who is carrying a phones moving in these cities. Now you would go, okay, these have surely got to be, exceptional authorities. Maybe they're only used in certain ways. But where did it come from in the first place? What is the legal grounding for using this for the DOJ operating this program domestically in the United States, which is the case today? I mean, that's the story the Wall Street Journal broke. When we look at where it came from, we see that it was actually broken in a story by The Intercept earlier this year, a program called Shenanigans. Incredibly enough, I can't imagine who chose that code name, but they call it Shenanigans. This is a program putting these sort of stingrays on phones. It's actually called a dirt box, DRT box. Putting it on a phone and using these things in Yemen to target the drone program. They try to figure out where this phone is, and then they shoot a missile at it. That's what this program was developed for. It was an extraordinary authority that was being used overseas, allegedly against terrorists. And yet we saw within the span of just a few years, without any public awareness, without any debate in Congress, without any authorizing legislation, now it's being operated in the United States to find common criminals that are not threatening, the existence of our society. How can this possibly be justified without the involvement of the public in some way, in some manner? And as was mentioned previously, these programs are not briefed to all members of Congress. When we talk about sort of these covert programs, these black programs, missile strikes, drone strikes, raids in Abbottabad, we're relying on a very small group of people. They're called the Gang of Eight and so forth. Even when we expand this to the Intelligence Committee, the incentives are entirely wrong for them to represent the public interest, because everyone sitting on the Intelligence Committee, even opponents of the agencies, people like Wyden and Udall, receive twice as much in terms of campaign donations from defense contractors, from people who are seeking business with the NSA, for the CIA and so forth, as any other member of Congress. So they have every incentive to approve these programs, to maintain their own chairs, their own seats, as to hold the people who are asking for them and authorizing them to account of the law. And we need to think about how we can fix these structures, how we can fix and provide for mechanisms that will prevent this in the future.
Something you just inspired. Something you said just inspired. Maybe this is just a sort of yes or no, but I was wondering in sort of the mirror universe where there's evil Edward Snowden, who's motivated not to disclose things for I guess because they think it's in the public interest, but because they want to help one political party and hurt the other, let's say. Could evil Edward Snowden have targeted someone for those sort of political purposes and gotten? Do you think your evil counterpart could get away with that by gaming the system?
Absolutely. I mean, it's no secret. Here we are sitting in, I don't know, December 2014. And the NSA still says, when asked in public under congressional oaths and everything like that, what did he get? Referring to me. And they still don't know. If their auditing is so poor that after a year and a half of investigation, God knows how many man hours spent, God knows how much money, how many forensics professionals they brought in, they can't tell what happened with an individual who, like myself, was not trying to cover his tracks. What's going to happen when they have an individual in a position of privileged access who is trying to stay under the radar, who is trying to abuse the system, who is trying to use sort of these incredible authorities, these exceptional powers, for the benefit of themselves, their class, their group, their own interest? Today, there is no protection against that, and that's a incredibly dangerous, incredibly concerning problem. And unfortunately, they haven't provided an answer for it.
I think we have time for one last question. And honestly, there's so many people who really want to know about your personal life. So I'm going to combine them into like one question, which is do you expect to return to the U.S.? I think you've said yes. Do you like wine? I think you've said you don't drink wine. I would like to know why you chose the name Citizen 4. And I also wanted to say, you mentioned in your New Yorker interview that you're working on a tool that you might offer to journalists in dangerous areas. And I wondered if you could update us on that. So combine those into one.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah, it is my goal to return to the United States. Unfortunately, there are no provisions under the mechanisms, the charges that have been leveled against me for a fair trial. That provides some challenges. I'm constantly working with the government to try to see if there's any way that we can do this in a manner that serves the public good. Unfortunately, everything that we've heard implies that they want to basically use me to scare everybody in the world out of ever saying the public has the seat at the table of government. The public has a seat at the table of government. And obviously, that's fundamentally something that I will never agree with. So there's work to be done there, but we see things changing over the time. The government's becoming more open, and hey, who knows what the future holds. Also, internationally, it's becoming more and more clear, and as well in the United States, as no harms surface, that this really, I never should have had to do this in the first place. So we'll see. Second thing was, do I drink? No, I don't drink. I've actually never been drunk. It's not a religious thing, an ideological thing. I just don't like the way it tastes. I'm kind of weird like that. Citizen 4, I'm neither the first nor the last. And when I was thinking about that, I used a number of pseudonyms. But the point that I wanted to reflect was that this is a tradition in the history of American civil society. People have to put themselves on the line. People have to take risks. Citizens have not just an interest, but an obligation in not just believing in an ideal, but standing for it and challenging the government when it goes too far. If we see our Constitution being violated on a massive scale, and we have been demanded by our own government, by these officials, to swear an oath that we will protect that Constitution against all enemies, not just foreign, but domestic as well. We have a duty to stand up and do something about it. And I tried to do my best to do that, and that's what that pseudonym reflects. And I hope that others will do the same in the future. I hope that we will have no need for something as dramatic as we've seen in the last year, but we'll go from there. And the last one, I've completely lost track. I'm sorry, I have a short work memory.
Whether you're working on a tool to protect journalists and other.
Okay, right. So that is still an area of active focus. I'm doing a lot with Freedom of the Press Foundation. I'm pursuing other venues to do this as well. There are active projects that I'm working on developing. But I'm actually beginning to develop in my thinking there, which is we should not develop tools that are specific to journalists. We should provide tools which are targeted towards a general audience, which provide value, and they serve everyone, but they also take a specific interest in providing to protect the use cases that are common to journalists. Because the issue is, if we create a tool, if I provide a tool tomorrow which says, all right, journalists, your sources can communicate with you on this, it'll be bulletproof, ever see your communications, which by the way is a fantasy. It's much more nuanced than that. You stand out like a sore thumb when people are looking at the crowd. When you look at the analysis that all the mass surveillance systems are doing, they go, all right, who is using the communications signature of this one program that we know is associated with journalist source communications?
I don't remember who said it, but it has been said that encryption is a bit like the One Ring. It makes you invisible to ordinary mortals, but highly visible to the Nazgul.
That is precisely it. Suddenly, the NSA and every signals intelligence group in the world goes, oh man, why is this person different? What's special going on there? But we see this is increasingly actually changing, and we're normalizing the use of encryption, which is why it's so important. We have to create an environment in which everybody, we provide a herd immunity. We're hiding within the crowd. And this is being done through efforts like Tor, which has been going on for a number of years. It's a very good program. I use it myself. I trusted my life to it, and history shows that it did work, although it's not bulletproof and it has had flaws and will in the future. HTTPS for transactional things, basically what you use for your bank transactions online, peer-to-peer communications, all of this stuff has to happen at a greater and greater level. I will say one thing I have to point out that I'm a little disappointed in is Amazon.com still uses unencrypted communications by default for all of your browsing. When you go and look at a copy of 1984 online, or you look for a book about community organizing, protesting, petitioning the government, wherever you're at, wherever that jurisdiction is, they can see what books you're looking at. This is incredibly dangerous, and I think it's morally irresponsible. And as a business, it's problematic for Amazon to allow this to continue, when we know for a fact that they have the capability to provide for secure communications, because as soon as you go to purchase that book, as soon as money's involved, they turn it over to encrypted communication. So I would hope that Amazon would take a position there where they say, all right, guys, we waited too long. Let's encrypt your browsing habits. Let's encrypt the world's library.
Something our friends from the Washington Post can convey to Jeff Bezos. So, Mr. Snowden, I'm afraid I would love to do this for another hour, but we are at the end of our allotted time. So I just wanted to thank you for both taking the time to talk to us, and to thank you for taking the risks you have to inform the public.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to drop out so you guys can go out to your party, and I'm no longer disrupting the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Obviously, you'll have a lot of people eager to welcome you if you do come back one day. This seems like a great segue. We don't, unfortunately, have Snowden to do tech support, but we do have the next best thing. We have an incredible array of experts in encryption tools. So for about 10 minutes, you can just grab a drink, mingle, chat, and then those of you who are interested, head upstairs. We'll have 3 half-hour sessions repeating. The first one will start again in about 10 minutes. And I hope you'll join me there. I look forward to learning from our experts just as you do.